the grieving parents sobbing uncontrollably at their baby boy's funeral when, suddenly, his tiny hand moved. What happened next would leave everyone in utter shock. Emma sat stiffly beside the small white casket, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her nails dug into her palms. She barely felt it. The pain in her chest, the hollow, unbearable weight of loss, drowned out everything else. Around her, the funeral home was filled with quiet murmurs, the occasional choked sob, the heavy scent of flowers meant to cover the staleness of death. But nothing could mask the awful truth sitting in front of her. Daniel was gone. Henry beside her barely moved. His eyes were empty, staring at their son's still face, as if his mind refused to register the finality of it. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips brushing the baby's cheek. A gentle touch, one he had done countless times before. Except this time, Daniel did not stir, did not blink, did not reach back for his father's hand like he always had. Henry inhaled sharply and pulled his hand away, his body tense. Emma's throat ached raw from too much crying, too many whispered prayers that had gone unanswered. She lifted her trembling hand and placed it over Daniel's tiny fingers, her thumb stroking absently over his knuckles, memorizing the shape of them, the softness of his skin. She told herself this would be the last time she would ever hold him, the last time she would ever feel him. But then, her brows knitted together. Something felt wrong. Not the grief, not the unbearable weight pressing down on her chest, but something physical. Daniel's skin was warm. Her mind immediately rejected it. That wasn't possible. A body lost warmth. A body turned cold. But Daniel wasn't cold. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath hitching in her throat as she gently squeezed his hand. No response. But the warmth remained. Aunt Christina, standing close by, leaned forward slightly, her wrinkled hand hesitantly reaching out to touch Daniel's forehead. Emma watched her, barely breathing, waiting for confirmation that she wasn't losing her mind. The older woman's face twitched, confusion flashing in her eyes as she quickly withdrew her hand. "He's warm," Christina murmured, barely above a whisper. Emma turned sharply to Henry, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Did you feel it?" Henry hesitated, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. His rational mind told him it was nothing, that bodies could sometimes hold warmth for a while after death. But Emma's voice was tight with something that sounded too much like hope. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached out again, pressing his palm gently against their son's forehead, then down to his tiny arm. His breath caught. It didn't make sense. The funeral home was not warm, and Daniel had been lying there for hours. His body should not feel like this. Henry pulled his hand back quickly, curling his fingers into a fist, but he said nothing. The murmurs around them grew. Someone took a step closer. A few of the older relatives began whispering prayers under their breath. The air in the room had shifted, the grief still present, but now laced with something else. Uncertainty. Then Emma gasped. She yanked her hand back from the casket, eyes wide, breath unsteady. "What?" Henry turned to her, alarmed. She didn't answer immediately, didn't even seem capable of it. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her fingers trembling. Then, slowly, she reached forward again, gripping Daniel's tiny hand, her own hands ice-cold in comparison. A silence stretched. And then, a twitch. A faint, weak movement. A sensation so small that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But then it happened again, this time more deliberate. Emma let out a strangled sound, something between a sob and a breathless cry. Her body shook, her grip tightening as her head snapped toward Henry. "He moved," she whispered, her voice trembling. Henry. He moved. His face paled. Emma. He squeezed my hand. The funeral home had gone completely silent now. Every pair of eyes was on them. Christina covered her mouth with both hands, her face stricken. Her cousin shifted uneasily, eyes darting between Emma and Daniel's still form, as if afraid to believe it. Henry's mind screamed for logic, for reason. His body was rigid as he reached forward, pressing his fingertips against Daniel's wrist, searching for something, anything that would tell him what was real. Nothing, not a twitch, not a pulse. He turned back to Emma, his jaw tight, his voice strained. Emma, listen to me. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, afraid of what he was about to say. Sometimes grief makes us feel things that aren't really there. Henry kept his hand on Daniel's forehead, waiting, searching for any shift, any flicker of something that could confirm what Emma swore she had felt. The warmth was still there, undeniable, steady against his palm. His heart pounded, and yet his mind fought against the possibility, clinging to logic like a man drowning in deep waters. Maybe it was just residual heat, the lingering warmth of a body not long past. Maybe it was nothing at all. But then, why did his gut twist with unease? Why did this feel so terribly, terribly wrong? Emma's breath was shallow beside him, her hands gripping the edge of the casket like she was holding on for dear life. She wasn't letting this go, and a part of Henry, the part that still clung desperately to hope, wasn't sure he could let it go either. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with her, searching for something in her expression that might tell him what to believe. But all he saw was raw, unshaken certainty. A rustle of movement from behind made him glance up. Aunt Christina was hovering nearby, her wrinkled hands twisting the rosary beads looped around her fingers. Her face was pale, drawn tight, with something between fear and hesitation. "We should call someone," she murmured. "Someone who knows more." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. No one spoke at first, as if saying it out loud had made this moment real, had forced them all to consider the impossible. If Daniel was alive, if there had been a mistake, then that meant... No, Henry couldn't even let his mind go there yet. Emma straightened abruptly. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. "We need a doctor." Henry's fingers twitched toward his pocket before he even realized what he was doing. His phone was in his hand within seconds, his breath uneven as he scrolled through his contacts. He knew who to call. He had to be sure. He had to know. Davy picked up on the second ring. "Hey, man," Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady, though it still came out wrong, thick with something he didn't want to name. "I need a favor. I need you to come to the funeral home. Now." There was a beat of silence on the other end before Davy responded. "The funeral home?" His voice was hesitant, like he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Just come. Bring Felipe with you." Felipe was a pharmacist, not a doctor, but he knew more than most. He had been in the business for years, had seen his fair share of things, had enough knowledge to tell them if they were losing their minds. Davy didn't ask questions. "We're on our way." Henry hung up and exhaled, his hands tightening around the phone. He looked back at Emma, then at Christina, then at the others gathered around, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and unease. "We wait," he said simply, and no one argued. The minutes stretched, slow and suffocating, the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing second. Emma hadn't moved, her hand still resting protectively over Daniel's. The warmth had not faded. Then, the door creaked open. Davy entered first, his eyes sweeping the room, taking in the tight expressions, the funeral setting, the fact that something here was deeply wrong. Felipe followed, his steps slower, more measured, his face unreadable. He was older, grey at the temples, his expression one of quiet calculation. Emma didn't waste a second. "Felipe, please, just check. Something is wrong." Felipe didn't hesitate. He set his bag down, rolled up his sleeves, and approached the casket. The entire room watched as he placed 2 fingers against Daniel's tiny wrist, waiting, his brows furrowed. He shifted slightly, pressing his palm against the baby's chest, then moving his hand up to Daniel's forehead. The silence was suffocating. Then, Felipe reached into his bag, pulling out a stethoscope. He hesitated only briefly before placing it against the baby's small ribcage. A long pause. His eyes narrowed, concentration deep. Another shift, another listen, a breath, a long, slow inhale. Then, Felipe lifted his head, and for the first time, something flickered across his face, something close to concern. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now, careful. "But something isn't right." Emma's fingers curled tighter around Daniel's hand. "What does that mean?" Felipe's gaze was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made Henry's stomach twist. "It means I don't have an answer. But a body that's been gone this long..." He glanced at the clock as if calculating, "shouldn't be holding warmth like this. And I can't say for sure, but I thought I heard something. Something faint." Henry inhaled sharply. Felipe straightened, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm not taking chances. We're calling emergency services. They need to get here now." Emma let out a shaky breath, her grip on Daniel never loosening. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might shatter. The sirens cut through the night, sharp and urgent, growing louder with each second. The distant wail sent a shiver down Emma's spine, the reality of the moment pressing in on her like a weight too heavy to bear. Around her, the funeral home had fallen into stunned silence, every breath held, every pair of eyes fixed on the door. Then, the red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The front doors burst open. 2 firefighters strode in, moving with the kind of calm urgency that only came with experience. They carried equipment, oxygen monitors, a stethoscope, a portable pulse oximeter, tools meant for the living. The contradiction of it all wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Henry took a step back, his fingers flexing at his sides. Emma, still holding Daniel's tiny hand, refused to let go, as if her grip alone could anchor him to this world. One of the firefighters, a man in his late 40s with graying hair at his temples, knelt beside the casket. His partner, younger, serious-faced, unpacked the equipment with practiced efficiency. Neither of them spoke at first. Felipe hovered close, his expression grim, his hands tucked into his pockets as if to stop them from shaking. "I don't know what you're going to find," he said quietly, "but something ain't right." The older firefighter nodded, his face unreadable. He reached for Daniel's wrist, pressing 2 fingers against the tiny pulse point. The room was so silent that every creak of the wood beneath their feet felt deafening. Nothing. The younger firefighter lifted the baby's hand, slipping the pulse oximeter onto Daniel's delicate finger. The device beeped once, then went silent as it calculated. A second passed, then another. The screen flickered. Emma sucked in a sharp breath, her nails digging into her palms. The firefighter frowned, adjusting the device slightly, waiting. The numbers appeared, weak, faint, but present. He looked up, eyes widening just slightly. "We have a reading." The words crashed over the room like a wave, sending murmurs and gasps through the gathered family members. Christina clutched at her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. Someone else grabbed onto the back of a chair for support. Henry felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't wishful thinking. Daniel was alive. The older firefighter wasted no time, pressing the stethoscope to the baby's chest, his expression unreadable as he listened. A long pause. Then he moved the scope again, adjusting. Another pause. Then something changed in his face, a flicker of recognition. He looked up at Emma and Henry, his voice steady but urgent. "We're getting a heartbeat. It's weak, but it's there." Emma let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth, her entire body trembling. Henry swayed slightly as if the weight of the moment had hit him all at once. The younger firefighter was already reaching for his radio. "We need an ambulance now. Infant with weak vitals, possible severe hypothermia or misdiagnosed fatality. We need transport ASAP." Emma gripped Henry's arm, eyes wild with both terror and hope. Daniel needed help. Right now. The firefighters worked quickly, their movements efficient as they lifted the baby from the casket with the utmost care. Emma felt the loss of that warmth instantly, her hands empty, aching. She wanted to hold him, to press him against her chest, to prove to herself that this was real. But there wasn't time for that. The baby was placed onto a portable stretcher, wrapped tightly in insulating blankets. One firefighter carefully adjusted an oxygen mask over Daniel's tiny face, his movements precise but gentle. The ambulance sirens screamed from outside, closer now, nearly upon them. The ambulance doors swung open and the paramedics moved swiftly, their voices low but firm as they coordinated with the hospital staff, waiting at the emergency entrance. Daniel, still wrapped tightly in insulating blankets, was lifted onto a gurney and wheeled inside, disappearing past the automatic doors before Emma or Henry could take another step. The last glimpse Emma caught of her son was the small oxygen mask covering his face, his tiny body swallowed up in medical equipment, and then he was gone, swallowed by the sterile white halls of the hospital. She moved to follow, but a firm hand stopped her. "Ma'am, sir, you need to wait here." The voice belonged to a nurse in blue scrubs, her expression unreadable but professional. "The doctors need to assess him first. As soon as we have an update, someone will come speak with you." Emma's breath hitched in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared past the nurse, willing the doors to open again, for someone, anyone, to come tell her that this nightmare was finally over. But they remained closed, a silent barrier between her and her child. Henry's fingers curled around her arm, grounding her, but there was no comfort in it. His own face was pale, his jaw set tight as he nodded stiffly to the nurse, though every muscle in his body screamed that he wanted to fight back, to force his way inside. He knew better than to argue, but that didn't make standing there any easier. They were left in the waiting room, surrounded by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled voices of hospital staff moving beyond the double doors. A few scattered patients sat in plastic chairs, lost in their own worries, but to Emma, the room felt empty. Time became unbearable. Every tick of the clock above the reception desk felt like an eternity. Every moment stretched thin with the weight of uncertainty. Emma sat hunched in one of the hard-backed chairs, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles turned white. Henry stood, unable to sit still, pacing a tight path in front of her, his hands moving restlessly through his hair. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Minutes blurred into something heavier, something unbearable. And yet no one came. No doctor, no nurse, no answers. Just silence. Emma swallowed, her throat dry, her stomach twisting with something that bordered on panic. What if they were wrong? What if something happened before they could help him? What if... The doors finally swung open. A man stepped out, his white coat crisp, his movements slow and deliberate as he scanned the waiting room. Emma's stomach lurched as soon as she recognized him. Dr. Nolan. Her nails dug into her palms. It felt like the air had been sucked from the room, like she was being pulled backward through time, dragged back to the moment she had last seen this man. The moment he had looked at her with that same detached expression and told her that her baby was gone. Now, he stood before her again, a clipboard in one hand, his face a mask of professional calm, but there was something too measured about the way he moved, something too controlled. Emma shot to her feet. Henry followed a second later, his body tensed like a wire pulled too tight, his jaw clenched. Nolan exhaled slowly, flipping through the papers in front of him before finally looking up. "I'm very sorry," he said, his tone flat, practiced. Daniel did not survive. Emma's world tilted. The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit. She stared at him, blinking, waiting for him to correct himself, waiting for someone to step in and tell her that this was a mistake. But Nolan just stood there, the same way he had before. Henry's breath came out sharp. He shook his head, his voice tight with disbelief. "That's not possible." Nolan tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his response. His vitals were extremely weak upon arrival. The doctors did everything they could, but ultimately... "No," Emma interrupted, her voice hoarse, shaking. "No, that doesn't make sense." Nolan didn't react. Emma took a step forward, her pulse roaring in her ears. "You told us he was dead before, at the hospital. You told us he was gone, and then..." Her breath hitched, rage and terror twisting together inside her chest. "And then we found out he wasn't. And now you're saying..." Her voice broke. "How does a baby die twice?" Nolan hesitated just slightly. It was barely noticeable, a flicker in his expression, a split-second pause that someone else might not have caught. But Emma saw it. Henry saw it. And something cold settled in the pit of Henry's stomach. Something was wrong. Emma took a step forward, her body rigid, her heart hammering so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. The flicker of hesitation on Nolan's face had been brief, almost imperceptible. But it was there. And now, that one fleeting moment of uncertainty had ignited something dangerous inside her. Something that refused to be ignored. Henry felt it too. The way his wife tensed beside him, the way her breathing turned shallow and sharp. His fingers twitched at his side, curling into a fist as he fought against the rising anger in his chest. He had spent too many hours drowning in grief, too many moments feeling powerless, but this was different. Emma's voice came low and steady, but there was steel beneath it. "I want to see my son." Nolan didn't react immediately. His grip on the clipboard tightened just slightly, his face carefully composed. But there was something in his stance, too controlled, too deliberate. "The body has already been taken for post-mortem procedures," he said, measured, almost rehearsed. "I understand this is difficult, but..." "No." Emma's voice cut through the sterile air like a knife, sharp and unwavering. Nolan blinked. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't back down. "I am not going to stand here and take your word for it. I want to see him. Now." A heavy silence stretched between them. The other staff members in the hallway had gone quiet, their eyes flicking between the grieving mother and the doctor standing before her. Henry could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Nolan's lips parted slightly, as if ready to protest, but he hesitated again. That flicker of uncertainty, just a breath of it, was enough to send a cold prickle down Henry's spine. Something was wrong. Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Either we see him now, or we call the police." Nolan inhaled slowly through his nose, his fingers tightening around the edge of his clipboard. The weight of the demand pressed down on him, on all of them. And for a split second, Henry saw something shift in his expression, something calculating. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Nolan exhaled and nodded once. "I will make the arrangements." He turned on his heel and walked briskly down the hall, disappearing behind the double doors without another word. Emma stood frozen for a moment before turning to Henry, her breath shaky. "We need to call the police." He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers arrived, their presence shifting the atmosphere instantly. Hospital staff murmured in hushed voices as the officers spoke quietly to Henry, nodding along as he explained their concerns. When Nolan returned, his steps slower now, more measured, his gaze landed on the officers before flicking back to Emma and Henry. "There's no need for this," he said smoothly, but there was a tightness around his mouth. "We are following protocol." One of the officers, a man in his early 50s with sharp eyes, held up a hand. "Doctor, we're going to need to verify the body ourselves. It's a simple request." Something in Nolan's jaw twitched, but he didn't argue. The group moved quickly through the halls, past sterile white walls and the scent of antiseptic, past nurses who exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Emma's stomach churned with every step, her hands clammy, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. They reached a quiet room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Nolan stepped aside. One of the officers pushed the door open fully and entered first, followed by the other. A moment passed. Then another. Then the first officer swore under his breath. Emma shoved forward, not waiting for permission, not caring who tried to stop her. She barely registered Henry's sharp intake of breath behind her as she stumbled into the room, her pulse roaring like thunder in her ears. And there, lying on the hospital bed wrapped in a thin white sheet, was Daniel. His chest, it moved. A shallow, barely there rise and fall, but it was there. Emma's knees buckled, a sound escaping her throat that she couldn't quite name, something between a sob and a gasp, something raw and unfiltered. The second officer was already moving, stepping past her, pulling his radio from his belt. "Get an emergency team in here now. The infant is still alive." Chaos erupted. The hospital erupted into chaos, the sterile walls echoing with hurried footsteps, clipped voices barking orders, and the distant wail of a machine coming to life as doctors and nurses rushed in. Daniel, still fragile, still teetering on the edge of life and death, was whisked away once more, his tiny body cradled in the careful hands of medical staff who should have been there for him from the very beginning. Emma stood, frozen, in the middle of it all, her breath ragged, her body trembling from the aftershocks of what she had just witnessed. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, so heavy, so unbearable, she felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. She had prepared herself for grief, for loss, for an emptiness that she thought would swallow her whole. But nothing could have prepared her for this. This wasn't a tragic accident. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone, Nolan, had looked her in the eyes, had told her, not once but twice, that her child was dead, and had fully intended for her to believe it. If she hadn't fought, if she hadn't listened to that gnawing voice inside of her that told her something wasn't right, Daniel would have been buried. A shudder ripped through her at the thought, a nausea curling in the pit of her stomach so violently that she thought she might collapse. Henry was beside her in an instant, his hands gripping her shoulders, his own face carved with the same raw horror, the same rage. His body was stiff, muscles locked, his eyes locked on the cluster of police officers now surrounding Dr. Nolan, who stood in the middle of them with his back straight and his face carefully blank, though his hands twitched at his sides. The officers wasted no time. "You're going to need to come with us, Doctor," one of them said, voice flat, unreadable. Nolan exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, measured and calm, as if he were explaining away a minor inconvenience instead of standing in the middle of what was quickly becoming the biggest medical scandal this hospital had ever seen. "I was following protocol. The child is alive," the officer interrupted, stepping closer, his voice edged with something sharp. "And you told his parents twice that he was dead. So either you're the most incompetent doctor this hospital has ever hired, or you have a hell of a lot more explaining to do." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Nolan's composure cracked, his mouth pressing into a tight line, his shoulders tensing just slightly. Emma watched, her heart hammering, as the officers turned to the hospital director, a man she had never seen before, an older gentleman with graying hair and weary eyes who had clearly been summoned in the wake of the growing scandal. He had been standing to the side, silent, observing, his face unreadable. "Dr. Nolan," the director finally said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like quiet resignation. "You will be placed on immediate leave pending investigation." Nolan barely moved, barely reacted. Then, slowly, he nodded. And just like that, it was done. As the officers took him by the arms, guiding him toward the exit, Emma felt a strange sensation wash over her. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. A step toward justice. A step toward the truth. The investigation moved quickly. Within days, it became clear that Daniel's case was not an isolated incident. Records were pulled, files were examined, and what they revealed sent a ripple of shock through not just the hospital, but the entire community. Nolan had a history of errors, not just small mistakes, not just minor miscalculations, but outright negligence. Cases of infants misdiagnosed, of premature declarations of death, of prescriptions that never should have been written. Some cases had been quietly settled, brushed under the rug, explanations neatly wrapped in technical jargon that most grieving families were too shattered to question. But Daniel's case was different. Because this time, the baby had lived. This time, there was no sweeping it under the rug, no technical excuse that could explain away the fact that Nolan had declared a living child dead twice. And the media had caught wind of it. By the end of the week, reporters crowded the hospital entrance, camera flashes reflecting off the glass doors, microphones shoved toward anyone willing to speak. The words medical negligence, cover-up, and manslaughter were whispered, then spoken, then shouted across news stations, igniting a storm that could no longer be contained. The world outside the hospital erupted in fury, a tidal wave of outrage sweeping through the city as Daniel's story spread beyond the sterile walls that had nearly become his grave. News anchors recounted the horrifying details in clipped, urgent tones, their faces grim as they detailed the sheer negligence that had almost cost an innocent child his life. Talk shows dissected every angle of the case, legal analysts debated the charges, and ordinary people, mothers, fathers, grandparents, took to the streets, demanding accountability. But inside the hospital, within the quiet confines of Daniel's room, none of that mattered. Emma sat at the edge of her son's bed, her fingers brushing against his tiny hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the delicate but steady rise and fall of his chest. She had spent days watching him, barely sleeping, barely breathing, as if the moment she looked away, he might slip through her fingers again. The machines that had once been his lifeline were being removed, one by one, replaced by nothing but time, by his own fragile but relentless will to survive. Daniel was fighting. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Emma allowed herself to believe that he might win. Henry stood by the window, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze distant. He had always been a quiet man, but since the moment Nolan had been led out of the hospital in handcuffs, he had barely spoken at all. Emma knew why. Justice was coming. There would be a trial, a verdict. But none of it would change the truth. They had nearly buried their son. No amount of punishment would ever erase that. Still, when Daniel opened his eyes for the first time in days, blinking up at them with an exhausted but undeniable awareness, Henry's shoulders sagged, and his breath left him in a shaky exhale. Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Their son had survived, and now they had to make sure no other child ever faced the same fate. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as people squeezed into the wooden benches, their eyes locked onto the man sitting at the defense table. Dr. Nolan, once a respected figure within the hospital, now sat hunched, his expression carefully neutral, his hands folded in his lap as his lawyer whispered something in his ear. Emma and Henry sat just a few rows behind the prosecution, their hands intertwined, their eyes never leaving the man who had nearly stolen their child from them. The trial had barely begun, but already the weight of the evidence was suffocating. The prosecutor stood with measured confidence, her voice steady as she laid out the facts, presenting medical records that showed the clear negligence in Daniel's case. A timeline of events was projected onto a screen, detailing the chain of failures that had nearly led to an unspeakable tragedy. The declaration of death without thorough examination. The refusal to allow the parents to see the body. The second attempt to cover it up when the truth began to surface. Then came the witnesses. A nurse took the stand first, her voice shaky as she admitted that she had questioned Nolan's decision but had been too afraid to challenge him. A fellow doctor followed, stating that he had never seen such a blatant misdiagnosis in his career. And then came the testimonies of other families, parents who had lost children under Nolan care, cases that had never made the news, quiet settlements made behind closed doors. But this case was different. This time the evidence was undeniable. When it was the defense's turn, Nolan's lawyer attempted to paint a picture of a man overworked, burdened by an overwhelmed healthcare system, a doctor who had made a mistake but had not intended harm. It was a weak argument, one that fell apart as soon as the prosecution presented a pattern of repeated negligence. A history of errors that had been ignored for far too long. Then, Emma was called to testify. She stood, her legs steady beneath her, her hands gripping the wooden railing, as she faced the man who had nearly stolen her son's life. Her voice did not shake. "You looked me in the eyes and told me my son was dead," she said, each word cutting through the silent courtroom like a blade. "And if I had listened to you, if I had believed you, I would have buried him. He would have been alive, trapped in a coffin, underground, because you couldn't be bothered to check if he was breathing." Nolan's expression barely changed, but for the first time she saw it, the flicker of something beneath his carefully blank face. Guilt, or maybe just fear. Emma stepped closer, her voice rising. "Do you have children, Doctor?" A pause. He didn't answer. Emma's hands curled into fists at her sides. "If you do, I hope you never have to stand where I am standing right now. I hope you never have to imagine what it would feel like to bury a child who isn't dead." She turned away before she could see his reaction. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The verdict came after hours of deliberation, the courtroom silent as the judge read the final decision. Dr. Nolan was found guilty. 15 years in prison. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But as Emma sat beside Henry, her fingers tangled in his, she realized that this wasn't just about Nolan anymore. This was about every parent who had lost a child to negligence. This was about every mistake that had been swept under the rug, every grieving family who had been told there was nothing they could do. This was about making sure no one else would ever have to stand in a funeral home, staring down at a casket, wondering if their child was still breathing inside. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the weight in Emma's chest felt lighter, the air outside fresher, the sky impossibly wide above them. Daniel was waiting for them at home, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the future was theirs again. This story is a harrowing yet powerful tale of resilience, a mother's unshakable intuition, and the fight for justice in the face of unimaginable negligence. From the depths of grief at Daniel's funeral to the shocking revelation that he was still alive, Emma and Henry's journey is a testament to the strength of parental love and the instinct that refuses to accept what doesn't feel right. Their desperation, anger, and relentless pursuit of the truth keep readers on edge, forcing them to question how often medical errors go unnoticed or are deliberately concealed. What makes this journey so impactful is its raw humanity. The overwhelming fear, the heartbreak of almost losing a child, and the burning need for accountability. The court trial not only serves as justice for Daniel, but also becomes a beacon of hope for other victims of negligence, proving that silence should never be an option. This story teaches a profound lesson. Blind trust in authority can be dangerous, and questioning what seems wrong can mean the difference between life and death. It reminds us that persistence, courage, and love can triumph over even the darkest moments, ensuring that justice is served and lives are saved. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.